The characteristics of fascism, the importance of the leader. One final aspect of fascism's attempt to control every aspect of society is the level of importance they put on the personage of the leader. Not necessarily just an emphasis on leadership as such, but rather the leader as an individual person. In the fascist formulation of society, the people were the nation was the state, and the state, ultimately, was one and the same as the leader. For the Japanese, the veneration of the emperor was a key aspect of state Shintoism, as well as Japanese national identity. The belief that the emperor was descended from the sun goddess was the official line of the Japanese government. Whether or not people believe this to be literally true is debatable. The authors of the Kokutai no Hongi write, quote, "Our country is established with the emperor, who is descendant from Amaterasu Omikami, the sun goddess, as its center, as our ancestors as well as we ourselves constantly have beheld in the emperor the fountainhead of her life and activities. For this reason, to serve the emperor and to receive the emperor's great august will as our own is the rationale of making our historical life live in the present, and on this basis the morality of the people." Japanese culture is largely made up of a series of concentric circles of obligations and duties. Honor and shame are inextricably tied up with whether or not, to what extent, one fulfilled or failed to fulfill one's obligations. These obligations were largely structured around ideals of filial piety. There were duties and obligations towards one's parents, one's spouse, one's family, one's community, one's nation, and ultimately, one's leader. Following the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese government did its best to make the obligations to the emperor the primary obligation for every Japanese person. As the authors of the Kokutai no Hongi instruct Japanese citizens, quote, "Loyalty means to revere the emperor as our pivot and to follow him implicitly. By implicit obedience is meant casting ourselves aside and serving the emperor intently. To walk this way of loyalty is the sole way in which we subjects may live, and the fountainhead of all energy. Hence, offering our lives for the sake of the emperor does not mean so-called self-sacrifice, but the casting aside of our little selves to live under his august grace, and the enhancing of the genuine life of the people of a state." Unquote. Loyalty to the emperor and to the state were taken to suicidal extremes by the Japanese military. Believing that surrender or capture would lead to dishonor, the Japanese fought ferociously, often to the last man, and often engaged in tactics like the banzai charge, the kamikaze, or even pretending to be dead and ambushing when their enemies drew close. Everything that the Japanese military did was done in the name of the emperor. The reverence for the emperor was a long-standing cultural institution that dated back to the earliest days of Japanese history. The emperor was a cornerstone of Japanese culture and national identity. As one Japanese prisoner of war told his interrogators, quote, "A Japan without the emperor is not Japan," unquote. Very few Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner during the Second World War. Of those captured, most had been wounded or unconscious when they were taken. Not many had surrendered of their own volition. Even as it became apparent that the Japanese would lose the war, and the popularity of the war declined among the civilian population and the POWs, even then the reverence for the emperor continued. Quote, "Out of all the collected interviews of prisoners of war, only 3 were even mildly anti-emperor," unquote. The Japanese were particularly primed by the history of their culture to accept a near-personality cult of their emperor. The Japanese militarists exploited this cultural priming for their own benefit. Their conquests and policies were all done in the name of the emperor. Kita Ikki's hope to restructure government and society of Japan, his desire to subvert the elites, and to confiscate property from the wealthy, all were expressed in the name of the emperor. The Italian fascists, likewise, built a cult of personality around the figure of Mussolini, dubbing him Il Duce. However, the Italians did not have the same cultural priming that the Japanese had. a hurdle that the fascists had to overcome. Furthermore, the fascists had to contend with other ideologies and their conflicting conceptions of the state and leadership. In particular, the fascists strongly opposed the liberal conception of leadership needing to be limited and checked. While the fascists wanted to expand the power of the leader, the liberals sought to constrain his powers. Alfredo Rocco, critical of the liberal conception of leadership, writes, quote, "All the efforts are therefore directed to see to it that the ruler, mandatory of all and entrusted with the realization through and by liberty of the harmonious happiness of everybody, should never be clothed with undue power. Hence, the creation of a system of checks and limitations designed to keep the rulers within bounds, and among these, first and foremost, the principle of the division of powers, contrived as a means for weakening the state in its relation to the individual." Unquote. Liberalism's fear of leaders having too much power or abusing the power that they have are clearly weak-willed and unwilling to do what is necessary to benefit the people. If the liberals had a spine, according to the fascists, they would allow the leader, who is the voice of the people, to do what is necessary. This, for the fascists, is yet another reason why liberalism was a dead ideology and why the future belonged to the totalitarians. For the Nazis, the importance of the leader was tied up with their notions of racial identity. According to the Nazis, a people select a leader not through democracy or elections, but rather through the urging of their own inherent racial interests. A leader gains his legitimacy insofar as he satisfies the racial needs of his people. Historian A. James Gregor writes, quote, "Individuals followed a political leader not simply because of an electoral decision, but because they recognize in their obedience a common response to a shared sentiment." Unquote. Nazi ideas around leadership were also tied up in a distrust of the mass of the people as a whole, a disbelief in the institutions of civil society. If there was no leadership, if there was no state, if there was no economic plan, then nothing of value would be propagated by society. Hitler, in a speech titled Obedience über alles, told his audience that, quote, "Nothing is possible unless one will commands, a will which has to be obeyed by others, beginning at the top and ending only at the very bottom." Unquote. People on their own could not be trusted to get things done without being told what to do from the top. Furthermore, Nazi ideas of leadership demonstrate the fascist emphasis upon social and political hierarchy. There must always be someone on top and someone below, someone to give orders and someone to obey those orders. But by maintaining this kind of hierarchical loyalty and duty, the Nazis believed that they strengthened the core of their society. Hitler told an audience that, quote, "We must train our people so that whenever someone has been appointed to command, the others will recognize it as their duty to obey him. For it can happen that an hour later they will be called upon to command, and that they can do it then only if others in turn obey. This is the expression of an authoritarian state, not of a weak, babbling democracy, of an authoritarian state where everyone is proud to obey." Unquote. In order for society to work, it must be structured in a hierarchical fashion. There must be someone at the top to give orders, and someone below to follow them. If the leader says jump, all of society must ask how high. Liberalism was inherently doomed to the grave because its emphasis upon individualism and freedom allowed for selfish and egoistical elements to undermine society. According to the fascists, liberal society was rotten to the core and would inevitably be knocked down. The fascists clearly believed that the personage of the leader was of utmost importance, not necessarily ideals of leadership as qualities or of institutions around the halls of leadership, but the leaders themselves. The totalitarian systems of the fascist regimes invariably developed cults of personality around their core leadership.